They drove the blade deep into her thigh during what was supposed to be a routine night exercise, watched her collapse in the mud, then left her there to bleed out in the darkness. 3 fellow operatives. 3 people she'd trusted with her life countless times before. They took her radio, disabled her GPS tracker, and reported back to base that Lieutenant Maya Chen had been separated from the unit during a chaotic firefight simulation. Case closed. Mission complete. Except they made one critical mistake. They underestimated what happens when you wound a Navy SEAL instead of killing her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Because what crawled out of that swamp 6 hours later wasn't the same person who'd gone in. Something had awakened in the blood and the pain. Something primal and precise that her instructors at Coronado had only whispered about in the darkest corners of advanced combat training. They called it the bleeding edge, that razor-thin line between injury and enhancement where adrenaline, training, and pure survival instinct fused into something beyond human limitation. Most operatives never found it. Those who did rarely came back the same. Maya Chen didn't just find it. She weaponized it. By dawn, she was moving through the forest like a phantom, her wounded leg driving every step with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The pain had become fuel. The blood loss had sharpened her focus to a surgical point. Where others would have sought medical attention, she sought understanding. Where others would have called for backup, she called upon every lesson learned in the crucible of SEAL training. Because somewhere in that swamp, between the moment the knife went in and the moment she stopped screaming, Maya had discovered something her betrayers would never comprehend. Navy SEALs don't just endure pain, they transform it. The irony was perfect. Master Chief Rodriguez, Petty Officer Williams, and Seaman Graves had chosen to wound her because they thought it would be cleaner than an outright killing. More believable. A training accident, they'd reasoned. A slip in the mud, a fall onto broken equipment, tragic but explainable. They'd calculated the blood loss, estimated the time to unconsciousness, factored in the remote location and the storm rolling in that would wash away evidence. They'd planned everything except for the possibility that their victim had been forged in furnaces. They couldn't imagine. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Maya Chen had volunteered for every experimental training program the Navy had ever conceived. She'd endured hypothermia conditioning in Alaskan waters, pain resistance protocols in classified facilities, and combat effectiveness studies that pushed human physiology beyond mapped boundaries. She'd been injected with experimental compounds that enhanced healing, subjected to controlled trauma that rewired neural pathways, and conditioned through methods that remained buried in Pentagon archives. Not because she was expendable, but because she was exceptional. Because when the military wants to know how far a human being can be pushed, they don't ask volunteers. They find the rare few who ask to be pushed. The stabbing wasn't an ending. It was an activation sequence, while Rodriguez was filing false reports back at Firebase Talon, while Williams was disposing of her equipment in the river, while Graves was rehearsing his lies about the last time he'd seen her. Maya was discovering that blood could be a compass and pain could be a weapon. She was learning that a SEAL's training doesn't shut down when the body is compromised. It evolves, adapts, overcomes. She spent that first night in the swamp not hiding from her hunters, but studying them, tracking their movements through the forest, cataloging their patrol patterns, memorizing their radio frequencies. The wound in her leg leaked crimson breadcrumbs that she used to mark territory, to create false trails, to paint messages only she could read. When hypothermia should have claimed her, her core temperature stabilized. When shock should have clouded her judgment, her tactical awareness expanded. When exhaustion should have claimed her consciousness, she found reserves of energy that defied medical explanation. By the second day, she wasn't just surviving. She was hunting. The 3 men who'd betrayed her had no idea they were being watched, studied, evaluated by someone who'd transformed their assassination attempt into a masterclass in enhanced combat operations. They thought they were covering their tracks, but Maya was mapping their every move from shadows they didn't know existed. They thought they were safe behind their lies, but she was recording every contradiction in their stories, every nervous glance, every moment of guilt that leaked through their practiced deceptions. When she finally walked back into Firebase Talon on the 3rd morning, limping but upright, bleeding but unbroken, the entire base fell silent. She didn't arrive in a medical evacuation helicopter. She didn't stumble through the gates pleading for help. She simply appeared at the morning formation, took her place in line, and waited for roll call. The bandage around her thigh was crude but effective. The dried blood on her uniform was arranged in patterns that spoke of controlled movement, deliberate action, tactical positioning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She'd turned her wound into a weapon, her pain into precision, her betrayal into a blueprint for justice that would redefine how the Navy thought about resilience, survival, and the true meaning of leaving no one behind. The 3 men who'd stabbed her were about to learn that when you wound a Navy SEAL, you don't create a victim. You create an adversary unlike anything you've ever faced. And Maya Chen was just getting started. Now, before we dive into exactly how Maya turned a near-fatal betrayal into the most legendary comeback in modern military history, we need you to do something crucial. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to witness will completely change how you think about human resilience and the true depth of military training. This isn't just another war story. This is a masterclass in psychological warfare that most people will never hear about. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. And more importantly, tell us this: have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Because today's story is going to show you what happens when that betrayal awakens something that was never meant to be awakened. We're talking about classified training protocols, experimental combat enhancement programs, and psychological conditioning techniques that push the human mind and body beyond what most people think is possible. Here's what makes this story different from every other military tale you've ever heard. Maya Chen wasn't just any Navy SEAL. She was part of a program so classified that even now, years later, most of the details remain buried in Pentagon black sites. She'd volunteered for experimental procedures that would make most Special Forces operators walk away. Pain tolerance studies that rewired neural pathways. Biochemical enhancements that altered how her body processed trauma. Psychological conditioning that turned suffering into strength. But here's the thing, and this is why you absolutely need to share this video with someone who thinks they know what real toughness looks like. None of her betrayers knew about her background. To them, she was just another SEAL, skilled, sure, dangerous, absolutely, but still human, still limited by the same biological constraints that govern everyone else. They had no idea they were about to discover what happens when you activate protocols that were designed to turn ordinary soldiers into something beyond human limitation. They thought they were eliminating a threat. Instead, they were unleashing one. And before we show you exactly how Maya turned their betrayal against them, we want to know what you think. Do you believe there are limits to human endurance? Or do you think the right training can push someone beyond what we consider possible? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because after you see what Maya accomplished with a knife wound that should have killed her, you might change your mind about what humans are really capable of. The military has spent decades studying pain, trauma, and the breaking points of human psychology. They've developed techniques for turning weakness into strength, fear into focus, and injury into advantage. Most of these methods remain classified, Most of the soldiers who've undergone this training can never speak about what they experienced. But sometimes, just sometimes, circumstances align in a way that allows the truth to surface. Maya's story is one of those rare glimpses behind the curtain. A real-world demonstration of training so advanced, so psychologically sophisticated, that it sounds like science fiction. But it's not fiction. It's documented fact, witnessed by dozens of military personnel. Recorded in after-action reports that most people will never see. So make sure you're subscribed. Because we're about to take you inside Firebase Talon on the night everything changed. We're going to show you exactly how 3 experienced military operators convinced themselves that betraying their teammate was not just justified, but necessary. We're going to walk you through their planning process, their execution, and the moment they realized they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. But most importantly, we're going to show you what Maya discovered about herself in that swamp. What she learned about pain, about survival, and about the hidden capabilities that emerge when someone trained to never quit is pushed beyond every limit they thought they had. This isn't just a story about military betrayal. It's a story about human potential, about what lies dormant in all of us until circumstances demand its awakening. It's about the difference between surviving and thriving, between enduring and transcending, between being a victim and becoming something that victims can never imagine. Are you ready to see what happens when a Navy SEAL discovers she fights better when bleeding? Because once you witness what Maya accomplished in the 72 hours after that knife went into her leg, you'll never look at human limitations the same way again. Stay with us. This is just the beginning. The temperature at Firebase Talon dropped 15 degrees after midnight, turning the humid jungle air into something that clung to skin like cold silk. Mist rose from the heated earth in ghostly spirals, creating a natural camouflage that made the perimeter seem to breathe with phantom movement. The base sat carved into a hillside clearing, surrounded by dense tropical forest that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Ancient trees towered overhead like cathedral pillars, their canopy so thick that even in daylight, the jungle floor remained in perpetual twilight. Tonight, that darkness felt different, predatory. The firebase itself was a study in controlled chaos. Prefabricated structures arranged in precise military geometry, connected by elevated walkways that kept personnel above the mud and standing water that never seemed to drain completely. Floodlights created islands of harsh illumination separated by pools of impenetrable shadow, while the constant hum of generators provided a mechanical heartbeat that never quite drowned out the jungle's organic symphony of insects, birds, and things that moved without names. In the equipment bay, Master Chief Rodriguez stood checking night vision batteries under the sterile glow of LED strips. His movements were methodical, practiced, but his jaw carried a tension that hadn't been there during the day. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling air, and his eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds like a man expecting unwelcome visitors. The fabric of his uniform was perfectly pressed, his equipment arranged with obsessive precision, but his breathing was shallow, controlled in the way of someone managing anxiety through routine. 50 yards away, in the communications bunker, Petty Officer Williams sat hunched over radio equipment that cast his face in an eerie blue glow. His fingers moved across the controls with nervous energy, cycling through frequencies that crackled with distant chatter from other bases, other operations, other worlds that seemed impossibly far from this moment. The sound of his own breathing echoed off the concrete walls, amplified by the enclosed space into something that sounded like fear given form. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he kept lifting the mug to his lips anyway. A nervous habit that provided the illusion of normalcy. Near the motor pool, Seaman Graves paced a tight circuit between the Humvees, his footsteps creating a rhythmic pattern on the gravel that matched his elevated heart rate. His hands kept returning to his equipment belt, checking and rechecking gear, that he'd already verified a dozen times. The vehicles around him squatted like sleeping beasts, their armor plating reflecting the perimeter lights in fragmented patterns that made shadows dance across his face. Every distant sound, the snap of a branch, the call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through leaves, made him pause and scan the darkness beyond the fence line. The air itself seemed charged with potential energy, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere becomes electric and every nerve ending anticipates the lightning strike. Humidity mixed with diesel fumes, gun oil, and the green smell of jungle vegetation created an olfactory cocktail that was uniquely military, uniquely tropical, uniquely tense. The kind of atmosphere that made seasoned soldiers check their weapons one more time and junior enlisted personnel wonder what their instincts were trying to tell them. In the distance, howler monkeys began their evening chorus, their voices carrying across the canopy like warnings echoed from tree to tree. The sound was primal, unsettling, a reminder that this place existed according to rules older and more fundamental than military doctrine. Rules where the strong survived and the weak became food for things that hunted in darkness. The perimeter sensors cast invisible webs through the jungle, creating a technological barrier that extended hundreds of meters beyond the physical fence. Motion detectors, thermal cameras, and seismic monitors painted an electronic picture of the surrounding terrain. But tonight their data stream seemed somehow inadequate, as if whatever was coming wouldn't register on instruments designed to detect conventional threats. Steam rose from the mess hall's ventilation system, carrying the scent of military-grade coffee and processed food that had been reheated too many times. Inside, a handful of night shift personnel moved through their routines with the mechanical precision of people who'd performed the same tasks countless times before. But even their mundane activities carried an undercurrent of tension. Conversations were shorter than usual. Laughter was rarer. Everyone seemed to be listening for something without knowing what they were listening for. The jungle pressed against the firebase's boundaries like a living thing, patient and persistent and utterly alien to the military mindset that demanded control, order, and predictable outcomes. Tonight, the darkness beyond the lights seemed deeper than usual, more complete, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something that would test every assumption about safety, security, and the reliability of human alliances. The air conditioning unit struggled against the humidity, creating a white noise backdrop that mixed with the distant rumble of aircraft engines and the occasional crack of branches settling in the cooling air. But underneath it all was something else, a quality of silence that spoke of predators moving with purpose, of plans being set in motion, of betrayals taking their first, tentative steps toward reality. This was the kind of night when experienced soldiers trusted their instincts over their instruments, when the smart ones checked their gear one more time, and when the wise ones remembered that the greatest threats often came from the places you never thought to look. The jungle knew what was coming. The darkness knew what was planned. And somewhere in that vast green cathedral of ancient trees and hidden dangers, forces were aligning that would transform 3 military careers and 1 extraordinary woman's understanding of her own capabilities. The night was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when betrayal would collide with something it had never encountered before. Lieutenant Maya Chen emerged from the tactical briefing tent at 0230 hours, her movements carrying the fluid precision that marked every gesture of someone who had survived selection processes that eliminated 90% of candidates before they even reached the real training. Her uniform bore no special insignia, no ribbons that would hint at the classified program she'd endured. But there was something in the way she carried herself that spoke of capabilities beyond standard military conditioning. Her stride was measured, economical, conserving energy while maintaining constant situational awareness. She stood exactly 5 feet 6 inches tall, compact and efficient, built like a precision instrument rather than a display of raw power. Her dark hair was regulation length, pulled back in a style that revealed the subtle scarring along her jawline, evidence of training exercises that had pushed her beyond normal human limits. Her eyes, deep brown and impossibly calm, held the kind of steady focus that unnerved people who weren't accustomed to being truly seen. When she looked at someone, she wasn't just observing their surface behavior. She was cataloging micro-expressions, reading stress patterns, analyzing threat potential with the unconscious efficiency of someone whose survival had depended on such assessments for years. Her equipment was arranged with meticulous attention to detail, but not the obsessive precision of someone trying to prove their competence. This was the gear arrangement of someone who had learned through repeated life-and-death situations that equipment failure meant mission failure, and mission failure meant people died. Her sidearm rested in a custom holster that showed signs of extensive use but careful maintenance. Her tactical knife was positioned for instant access, but secured against accidental deployment. Every piece of equipment on her person had been tested under conditions that would break most people's will to continue. 20 meters away, Master Chief Rodriguez watched her through the window of the equipment bay, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture betraying an underlying tension. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had built his reputation on unwavering loyalty to the chain of command and an ability to make hard decisions under pressure. His broad shoulders and weathered face spoke of countless deployments in hostile environments, but tonight something was eating at him from the inside. He'd requested this assignment specifically, pulled strings to ensure his team would be working with Chen on tonight's exercise. The official reason was professional development, learning from ASEAL's tactical approach. The real reason was buried in a conversation he'd had with certain parties, who had questions about Chen's psychological stability and her suitability for continued classified work. Rodriguez had spent his entire career following orders without question. But the orders regarding Chen felt different, heavier, the kind of directive that came with implications that extended far beyond military protocol. Someone wanted to know what Maya Chen would do when pushed beyond her breaking point. Someone wanted to test whether her experimental training had created an asset or a liability. And Rodriguez had been selected to conduct that test. Willing or not, Petty Officer Williams approached from the communications bunker, his technical expertise evident in the way he automatically adjusted equipment settings as he moved through the base. Williams was the kind of operator who understood that modern warfare was fought as much with information as with ammunition, and his ability to maintain secure communications under adverse conditions had saved more missions than anyone would ever know. But tonight, his usual confidence was shadowed by doubt. He'd seen Chen's psychological evaluation files, or at least the portions that weren't classified beyond his clearance level. The woman was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. Someone who had volunteered for experimental procedures that would give most people nightmares. Just reading about them. Williams had worked with special operations personnel for 8 years, and he'd learned to recognize the signs of soldiers who had been pushed too far. Chen didn't show any of those signs. If anything, she seemed to thrive on challenges that would break other people. That wasn't reassuring. It was terrifying. Because if someone could endure that much trauma and come out stronger, what did that say about what they might be capable of when the constraints were removed? Seaman Graves completed the triangle of tension, his youth and relative inexperience making him the perfect wild card in tonight's equation. Graves had joined the Navy to prove something to himself and his family, but he'd discovered that military service was less about heroism and more about 20 meters away, Master Chief Rodriguez watched her through the window of the equipment bay, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture betraying an underlying tension. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran who had built his reputation on unwavering loyalty to the chain of command and an ability to make hard decisions under pressure. His broad shoulders and weathered face spoke of countless deployments in hostile environments, but tonight something was eating at him from the inside. He'd requested this assignment specifically, pulled strings to ensure his team would be working with Chen on tonight's exercise. The official reason was professional development, learning from ASEAL's tactical approach. The real reason was buried in a conversation he'd had with certain parties, who had questions about Chen's psychological stability and her suitability for continued classified work. Rodriguez had spent his entire career following orders without question. But the orders regarding Chen felt different, heavier, the kind of directive that came with implications that extended far beyond military protocol. Someone wanted to know what Maya Chen would do when pushed beyond her breaking point. Someone wanted to test whether her experimental training had created an asset or a liability. And Rodriguez had been selected to conduct that test. Willing or not, Petty Officer Williams approached from the communications bunker, his technical expertise evident in the way he automatically adjusted equipment settings as he moved through the base. Williams was the kind of operator who understood that modern warfare was fought as much with information as with ammunition, and his ability to maintain secure communications under adverse conditions had saved more missions than anyone would ever know. But tonight, his usual confidence was shadowed by doubt. He'd seen Chen's psychological evaluation files, or at least the portions that weren't classified beyond his clearance level. The woman was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. Someone who had volunteered for experimental procedures that would give most people nightmares. Just reading about them. Williams had worked with special operations personnel for 8 years, and he'd learned to recognize the signs of soldiers who had been pushed too far. Chen didn't show any of those signs. If anything, she seemed to thrive on challenges that would break other people. That wasn't reassuring. It was terrifying. Because if someone could endure that much trauma and come out stronger, what did that say about what they might be capable of when the constraints were removed? Seaman Graves completed the triangle of tension, his youth and relative inexperience making him the perfect wild card in tonight's equation. Graves had joined the Navy to prove something to himself and his family, but he'd discovered that military service was less about heroism and more about following orders that sometimes conflicted with personal morality. Tonight's assignment was one of those conflicts. He'd been briefed on Chen's background in carefully edited terms that emphasized her experimental training without explaining its full implications. All he knew was that certain people in positions of authority wanted Chen tested under conditions of extreme stress, and his role was to provide that stress when the time came. The irony was that none of them understood what they were actually dealing with. Chen's files contained references to programs with names like Enhanced Resilience, Protocol, and Advanced Trauma Integration, but the real nature of her conditioning was buried in classification, levels that even Rodriguez couldn't access. They knew she was dangerous. They didn't know she was dangerous in ways that conventional military thinking couldn't comprehend. What they were about to discover was that betraying someone who had been psychologically conditioned to transform trauma into tactical advantage was like trying to drown someone who could breathe underwater. The experimental procedures Chen had endured hadn't just enhanced her pain tolerance or improved her survival instincts. They had fundamentally altered how her nervous system processed threat, how her brain interpreted betrayal, and how her body responded to injury. The three men converging on tonight's exercise thought they were testing a fellow soldier's breaking point. They had no idea they were about to activate something that their training had never prepared them to handle. The night exercise began with standard protocol, but the undercurrents of tension revealed themselves in a dozen small violations of normal procedure. Rodriguez's briefing was 30 seconds shorter than regulation required, his voice carrying a clipped efficiency that suggested urgency where none should exist. Williams' equipment check lingered too long on Chen's communication gear, his fingers making subtle adjustments that she noticed but didn't comment on. Graves avoided direct eye contact during the formation brief, his attention seemingly focused on his weapon maintenance, but his peripheral awareness tracked Chun's every movement with the intensity of someone studying a potential threat. The mission parameters seemed straightforward enough. Infiltrate a mock enemy compound located 7 kilometers through dense jungle terrain. Retrieve simulated intelligence packages and extract to a predetermined rally point before dawn. Standard reconnaissance protocol with communication. Checkpoints every 30 minutes and contingency procedures for equipment failure or enemy contact. Nothing that any of them hadn't done dozens of times before. But tonight the familiar routine felt weighted with unspoken complications. Chun took point position without discussion, her natural leadership asserting itself through competence rather than rank. Her movement through the jungle was fluid, economical, each step placed with precision that left minimal trace, while maintaining optimal positioning for both advance observation and rapid extraction if needed. She navigated by instinct through terrain that would challenge most experienced soldiers, reading the landscape like a language she'd spent years learning to speak fluently. But tonight, her usual tactical awareness was complicated by subtle inconsistencies in her team's behavior. Rodriguez's following distance was slightly greater than optimal for mutual support, creating gaps in their formation that violated basic small unit tactics. When Chun signaled for route adjustments, his response came a fraction of a second later than standard training would dictate, suggesting divided attention or conflicting priorities. His breathing pattern was wrong too, controlled rather than natural. The kind of respiratory discipline that indicated someone managing stress through conscious effort rather than combat-conditioned reflex. Williams demonstrated similar anomalies in his technical responsibilities. His radio checks were perfunctory. The growing tension reached a critical threshold approximately 4 kilometers into their movement when Chun detected equipment modifications that shouldn't have existed. Williams' radio pack contained additional hardware that wasn't part of standard communication gear. Rodriguez carried extra ammunition that exceeded mission requirements by margins that suggested preparation for extended engagement. Graves had modified his knife sheath for faster deployment, a detail that would be insignificant in most contexts, but became meaningful when combined with other behavioral anomalies. These discoveries triggered decision trees that Chun had hoped never to use in actual operations. Her experimental training included protocols for scenarios where trusted allies became hostile threats. But implementing those protocols required accepting that everything she'd believed about this mission was based on false premises. The psychological framework that had been carefully constructed through years of conditioning suddenly shifted from theoretical possibility to practical necessity. The most unsettling realization was that her teammates' behavior suggested coordination rather than individual initiative. This wasn't random hostility or personal conflict escalating beyond control. This was planned operation with multiple participants working toward shared objectives that excluded her survival. The implications extended beyond immediate physical threat to questions about authorization, command structure, and the possibility that her own organization had sanctioned her elimination. As they approached the halfway point to their objective, Chun made the tactical decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of confronting her teammates about their obvious deceptions, she would allow their plan to proceed until its true nature revealed itself completely. Her experimental conditioning had prepared her for scenarios where survival depended on letting enemies believe they held advantages they didn't actually possess. What her teammates didn't understand was that betraying someone with her background wasn't just dangerous, it was educational. Mock compound materialized from the jungle darkness, like a fever dream constructed of corrugated metal, sandbags, and tactical necessity. 3 structures arranged in a defensive triangle, connected by covered walkways that provided both protection and killing fields for anyone foolish enough to approach without proper reconnaissance. Floodlights created harsh pools of illumination separated by zones of impenetrable shadow, while motion sensors and simulated defensive positions added layers of complexity that transformed a routine training exercise into something. Approaching real combat conditions, Chen dropped to one knee at the tree line, her enhanced vision cataloging defensive positions, entry points, and extraction routes with the systematic precision of someone whose survival had depended on such analysis countless times before. The compound's layout was standard military architecture, but something about its positioning felt wrong. Too exposed to certain angles of approach, too vulnerable to tactics that any competent enemy would exploit. Unless the real purpose wasn't defensive simulation, but creating optimal conditions for something else entirely. Behind her, Rodriguez signaled for a tactical pause, his hand movements precise but carrying undertones of tension that wouldn't have been present during legitimate operations. His positioning was textbook correct for Overwatch duties, but his angles of observation focused more on Chun's location than on potential threats from the compound. Williams had deployed his communication equipment in a configuration that provided excellent technical functionality while creating blind spots that would limit his ability to observe or assist if the situation deteriorated. Unexpectedly, Graves completed their triangle of coverage, his weapon oriented toward perimeter security, but his body language suggesting divided attention between external threats and internal considerations. His breathing pattern was wrong, too controlled, too conscious, indicating someone managing anxiety through deliberate effort rather than combat-conditioned response. The kind of respiratory discipline that marked soldiers preparing for actions that conflicted with their training and personal ethics. Chun's enhanced conditioning included psychological protocols specifically designed for scenarios where trusted allies revealed hostile intentions. As she observed her teammates' behavior, those protocols activated automatically, shifting her cognitive framework from cooperative team member to isolated operator surrounded by potential threats. The transition was seamless, practiced, a mental gear change that had been drilled into her, subconscious through repetition that bordered on psychological restructuring. Irony was that her experimental training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. Betrayal by trusted allies wasn't an aberration to be feared, it was a predictable outcome, to be managed through superior preparation and tactical flexibility. Her conditioning had included extensive exercises where instructors and fellow trainees had been programmed to turn hostile without warning, creating psychological resilience that transformed potential trauma into tactical advantage. Rodriguez's voice crackled through their communication system with instructions that sounded routine but contained subtle deviations from standard protocol. Chun, take point on primary entry. Williams, establish overwatch on the eastern approach. Graves, secure our extraction route through the southern perimeter. The assignments were tactically sound but created separation that would isolate Chun from immediate support if complications developed. More significantly, they positioned her teammates to control all potential escape routes while placing her in the most exposed position. Chun acknowledged the orders with professional efficiency, while her enhanced awareness cataloged the tactical implications of their new positioning. Her experimental conditioning included training scenarios where survival depended on recognizing when cooperation had shifted to competition, when team dynamics had been compromised by external pressures, and when personal survival required abandoning trust in favor of individual capability. The approach to the compound required crossing 30 meters of open ground where natural cover was minimal and concealment. Options were limited to shadows and careful timing. Chen moved with the fluid precision that characterized all her actions. But tonight her movement pattern included subtle modifications that would be invisible to casual observation, but provided enhanced options for rapid direction, changes if the situation required immediate adaptation to hostile action from unexpected sources. Williams maintained communication protocols that sounded professional but included technical modifications that Chen's enhanced hearing could detect, frequency adjustments that weren't part of standard procedure, signal routing that created potential interception points, and timing delays that suggested coordination with parties not present in their immediate operational area. Her experimental conditioning included training in detecting communication compromises, and Williams' technical manipulations triggered analysis protocols that confirmed her growing certainty about their true intentions. Graves' perimeter security was maintained with mechanical precision, but lacked the adaptive flexibility that characterized experienced operators. His positioning was optimal for preventing external threats, but created tactical blind spots that would limit his ability to respond effectively if threats emerged from within their own team structure. More telling was his equipment preparation, subtle modifications that suggested readiness for close-quarters engagement rather than long-range security operations. Compound's interior was arranged according to standard defensive principles, but Chen's enhanced tactical analysis revealed positioning that was optimal for certain types of ambush scenarios, rather than legitimate intelligence-gathering operations. The target packages were located in positions that would require her to move through natural killing fields where coordinated fire from multiple positions would create intersecting fields of destruction that would be difficult to survive even with superior training and equipment. As Chen approached the primary entry point, her experimental conditioning completed its analysis of the developing situation. Probability calculations indicated greater than 90% likelihood that her teammates intended to eliminate her during this operation. Tactical assessment suggested that their plan involved using the compound's interior configuration to create optimal conditions for coordinated attack while maintaining plausible deniability through the appearance of training, accident, or enemy action. The most interesting discovery was that her enhanced psychological conditioning didn't generate fear or anxiety in response to these realizations. Instead, it produced a cold clarity that transformed potential victimization into tactical opportunity. Her experimental training had prepared her for scenarios where survival depended on allowing enemies to believe they controlled the situation, while secretly maintaining superior position. Through enhanced capabilities they couldn't predict or counter. Chen entered the compound with the confident stride of someone approaching a routine training exercise, while her enhanced awareness prepared for combat that would test every aspect of her experimental conditioning against opponents who had no understanding of what they were actually confronting. The blade entered Chen's thigh with surgical precision, driven by Rodriguez's expert knowledge of anatomy and his calculation that a femoral wound would incapacitate without immediately killing. The steel sliced through muscle fiber and nerve pathways with the kind of controlled violence that spoke of extensive training in close-quarters combat. But Rodriguez had made a fundamental miscalculation about his target's physiological responses to trauma. Chen's reaction was immediate, but not what any of them expected. Instead of the anticipated scream, shock, or collapse, her body's response followed pathways that had been carved through years of experimental conditioning. Pain signals reached her brain and were instantly processed through neural networks that had been systematically rewired to interpret trauma as tactical information rather than debilitating sensation. Her enhanced nervous system cataloged the wound's depth, angle, and trajectory while simultaneously calculating optimal responses. For various continuation scenarios, the most startling development was that her blood loss didn't trigger the expected physiological cascade toward unconsciousness. Her experimental conditioning included biochemical modifications that altered how her circulatory system responded to traumatic injury. Clotting factors activated with supernatural efficiency. Blood pressure adjusted to maintain consciousness despite volume loss. And her metabolism shifted into enhanced processing modes that turned physical trauma into a source of focused energy rather than systemic weakness. Rodriguez stepped back expecting to see Chen crumple to the forest floor, but instead watched her sink into a controlled crouch that positioned her wounded leg for optimal weight distribution while maintaining tactical positioning relative to all three attackers. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, showing no signs of the hyperventilation or shock response that should have accompanied such significant trauma. Most unsettling was her expression, calm, analytical, almost curious, as if she was observing an interesting, experimental result rather than experiencing a life-threatening assault. Williams moved to secure her communication equipment, but his approach was complicated by Chen's unexpected stability. She wasn't writhing in pain or pleading for medical assistance. She was watching him with the kind of intense focus that made his hands shake as he reached for her radio gear. When their eyes met, he saw something that would haunt him for months afterward, not fear or anger or betrayal, but calculation. She was studying him, memorizing his face, cataloging his actions with the methodical precision of someone collecting evidence for future reference. Graves approached from her left flank, his movement betraying the nervous energy that had been building throughout the evening. His role was supposed to be simple: secure her weapons and equipment, while Rodriguez and Williams handled the primary aspects of their operation. But Chen's unexpected composure transformed routine disarmament into something that felt more like diffusing a sophisticated explosive device that might detonate if handled incorrectly. Chen's enhanced conditioning kicked into full activation as her blood pressure dropped to levels that would normally trigger unconsciousness. Instead of losing cognitive function, her experimental modifications shifted her brain chemistry into heightened processing modes that enhanced pattern recognition, tactical analysis, and sensory integration. Pain became background data rather than overwhelming sensation. Blood loss became strategic information rather than systemic crisis. The wound in her thigh became a source of focused attention that sharpened rather than diminished her operational capabilities. The psychological impact on her attackers was immediate and profound. Rodriguez had planned this operation based on conventional understanding of trauma response and battlefield medicine. He expected Chen to follow predictable patterns of shock, panic, and gradual loss of consciousness that would allow them to complete their mission with minimal resistance. Instead, he found himself confronting someone whose response to serious injury violated everything he'd learned about human physiology during 2 decades of military service. Williams fumbled with Chen's communication equipment, his technical expertise compromised by the growing realization that their operation was deviating from all expected parameters. Chen's radio gear was more sophisticated than standard issue, incorporating encryption protocols and emergency beacon systems that he couldn't disable without additional time and tools they hadn't brought. Worse, her backup communication systems were integrated into her personal equipment in ways that suggested preparations for exactly this type of scenario. Chen's voice cut through their confusion with startling clarity. Textbook approach, Rodriguez. Clean entry angle. Optimal targeting for temporary incapacitation without immediate lethality. Williams, your technical modifications to my communication gear were competent, but not comprehensive. You missed the backup systems. Graves, your positioning is tactically sound but psychologically defensive, suggesting personal conflict about this operation's objectives. Her clinical analysis of their attack methodology sent chills through all three men. She wasn't responding like a victim. She was conducting a professional assessment of their performance with the detached interest of an instructor evaluating student exercises. Rodriguez found himself taking an involuntary step backward, his confidence shaken by the growing realization that their carefully planned operation had encountered variables they hadn't anticipated. The most unnerving aspect of Chen's response was her apparent lack of emotional reaction to their betrayal. No accusations, no pleas for mercy, no expressions of shock or hurt feelings. Instead, she observed their actions with the same analytical attention she might apply to studying enemy tactical procedures during debriefing sessions. Her experimental conditioning had apparently restructured her emotional responses to trauma in ways that transformed personal betrayal into professional learning opportunities. Chen's blood created dark patterns on the forest floor. But instead of weakening her, the blood loss seemed to enhance her focus. Her pupils dilated to maximize light gathering in the dim jungle environment. Her breathing shifted into rhythms that optimized oxygen utilization for sustained physical activity. Her muscle tension adjusted to compensate for the wounded leg while maintaining readiness for explosive movement if opportunities presented themselves. Rodriguez attempted to reassert control over the deteriorating situation by issuing orders that had worked effectively during countless previous operations. Secure her equipment and prepare for extraction. We maintain communication silence until we reach the rally point. But his commands lacked their usual authority, undermined by the growing awareness that they were dealing with someone whose responses didn't follow conventional patterns. Chen's enhanced conditioning had prepared her for scenarios where survival depended on allowing enemies to believe they controlled situations they didn't actually understand. As she watched her former teammates struggle to adapt their plans to her unexpected responses, she began implementing protocols that would transform their attempted murder into the most comprehensive tactical education any of them would ever receive. The jungle became Chen's laboratory, and pain became her most precise instrument. As Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves disappeared into the darkness believing they had eliminated a problematic asset, Chen discovered that her experimental conditioning had fundamentally altered how her body processed trauma. The wound in her thigh wasn't draining her strength, it was concentrating it, focusing every enhanced system in her physiology toward a single objective that her attackers couldn't have imagined. Her blood loss should have triggered unconsciousness within minutes, but her modified circulatory system had different protocols. Specialized proteins that had been introduced during classified medical procedures began crystallizing around damaged tissue, creating temporary biological scaffolding that maintained structural integrity while accelerating cellular repair. Her heart rate didn't spike into panic rhythms. Instead, it settled into a steady, powerful cadence that optimized circulation while conserving energy for sustained activity. The most remarkable transformation occurred in her neurological responses. Where conventional trauma would have flooded her system with stress hormones that impaired cognitive function, Chen's experimental conditioning triggered the release of synthetic compounds that enhanced mental clarity, expanded sensory integration, and accelerated decision-making processes. The stabbing hadn't created a victim. It had activated a weapon system that had been years in development. Chen remained motionless for exactly 47 minutes after her attackers departed. Not from weakness or shock, but from tactical calculation. Her enhanced hearing tracked their movement through the jungle until they were beyond natural observation range, while her modified vision adapted to the darkness with efficiency that bordered on superhuman. During this period of apparent helplessness, she was actually conducting comprehensive analysis of terrain features, weather patterns, and resource availability that would define her operational parameters for the next 72 hours. When she finally moved, her body's response defied every principle of trauma medicine. The wounded leg supported her weight without the expected weakness, nerve damage, or loss of fine motor control. Her experimental conditioning had included extensive modifications to pain processing pathways, transforming what should have been debilitating sensation into precise feedback about tissue status, healing progress, and operational limitations. She could feel exactly which movements would aggravate the injury and which would optimize her body's enhanced repair mechanisms. Chun's first priority was resource acquisition, but her approach would have been incomprehensible to conventional military thinking. Instead of seeking immediate medical attention or attempting to reach friendly forces, she began implementing survival protocols that had been specifically designed for operators whose physiology had been enhanced beyond normal human limitations. Her training had included scenarios where standard medical intervention would actually interfere with her body's modified healing processes. The jungle provided materials that most people would never recognize as medical supplies. But Chun's enhanced conditioning included extensive knowledge of biological compounds that could interact productively with her modified biochemistry. Certain plant extracts that would be toxic to normal humans could accelerate her healing processes. Tree resins that would cause allergic reactions in conventional physiology could be processed by her enhanced immune system into anti-inflammatory compounds. Insect proteins that would trigger dangerous immune responses could be converted by her modified digestive system into specialized nutrients that supported tissue regeneration. More importantly, her experimental conditioning had prepared her for combat operations while managing significant physical trauma. Traditional military training emphasized avoiding injury and seeking immediate medical support when wounded. Chun's conditioning was based on the opposite principle, maximizing combat effectiveness, specifically when conventional advantages had been compromised. Her enhanced systems didn't just help her survive injury. They helped her thrive because of it. The psychological aspects of her transformation were equally significant. Where normal human psychology would have been overwhelmed by betrayal, trauma, and isolation, Chun's experimental conditioning had restructured her emotional responses to transform negative experiences into tactical advantages. Betrayal became intelligence about enemy capabilities and motivations. Trauma became data about her own enhanced system's performance under stress. Isolation became freedom from conventional tactical constraints that limited normal operators. Chun's movement through the jungle during the first night demonstrated capabilities that her attackers couldn't have predicted. Her wounded leg didn't slow her progress. It altered her movement patterns in ways that actually enhanced her stealth characteristics. The slight compensation in her gait eliminated certain biomechanical signatures that motion detection systems were programmed to recognize. Her modified pain responses allowed her to maintain physical exertion levels that would have been impossible while managing conventional trauma. By dawn, Chun had established a tactical position that provided comprehensive observation of fire-based Talon, while remaining undetectable to standard surveillance systems. Her enhanced vision could track movement within the base perimeter from distances that exceeded normal optical capabilities. Her modified hearing could isolate conversations from ambient noise at ranges that defied conventional understanding of human sensory limitations. Most significantly, her experimental conditioning allowed her to maintain this level of surveillance activity while simultaneously accelerating her physical recovery through controlled metabolic processes. The most unsettling aspect of Chun's enhanced capabilities was their psychological impact on targets under observation. Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves had returned to base believing their mission was complete. But their behavior throughout the following day suggested unconscious awareness that they remained under hostile surveillance. Their sleep patterns were disrupted by dreams they couldn't remember clearly. Their routine activities were interrupted by inexplicable feelings of being watched. Their professional interactions were marked by tension and paranoia that they couldn't rationally explain. Chun's experimental conditioning included training in psychological warfare, techniques that exploited these subconscious awareness mechanisms. She wasn't just observing her targets, she was studying their behavioral patterns, identifying psychological vulnerabilities, and developing comprehensive profiles that would support future operations. Her enhanced cognitive processing allowed her to conduct this analysis while maintaining perfect concealment and accelerating her physical recovery through conscious direction of her modified biological systems. What her attackers had interpreted as successful elimination was actually the activation of capabilities they hadn't known existed, implemented by someone whose training had specifically prepared her for scenarios where survival depended on fighting better when bleeding. Chun's return to Firebase Talon was orchestrated with the precision of a master class in psychological warfare. She didn't stumble through the gates seeking medical attention or demand immediate audience with command personnel. Instead, she chose the exact moment when Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves would be most psychologically vulnerable, during the morning formation when their fabricated reports about her disappearance would be fresh in everyone's minds and their guard would be at its lowest. The timing was surgical. 800 hours, when the entire base population was assembled for daily briefings and work assignments. Maximum visibility, maximum psychological impact, minimum opportunity for her targets to prepare emotional defenses or coordinate response strategies. Chun approached the formation from the motor pool side, her path calculated to ensure that Rodriguez would see her first, giving him approximately 30 seconds to process her survival before the rest of the base became aware of her presence. Her physical appearance was carefully managed to maximize psychological disruption while maintaining professional standards. The wound in her thigh was concealed beneath fresh bandaging that suggested medical attention without indicating the source of treatment. Her uniform was clean, but showed subtle signs of field operations, enough to confirm that she'd been active during her absence, but not enough to suggest struggle or desperation. Her posture was erect, confident, completely inconsistent with someone who had survived attempted murder, followed by 3 days of jungle survival. Most unsettling was her demeanor. No trace of trauma, no hint of accusation, no suggestion that anything unusual had occurred during her absence. She moved through the base population with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her behavior before the attack, but with an additional quality that made everyone who encountered her deeply uncomfortable. She was observing everything with enhanced intensity, cataloging facial expressions, recording conversations, analyzing behavioral patterns with the focused attention of someone conducting comprehensive intelligence-gathering operations. Rodriguez's initial reaction was visceral and immediate. The color drained from his face as his nervous system processed information that contradicted everything he believed about the previous night's events. His hands began trembling before conscious thought could impose emotional control, and his breathing shifted into shallow, rapid patterns that indicated acute stress response bordering on panic. Most telling was his immediate glance toward Williams and Graves, confirming their coordination while simultaneously betraying his guilt to anyone trained to recognize such behaviors. Williams' response was more controlled but equally revealing. His technical expertise extended to understanding human psychology, and he recognized immediately that Chun's survival represented catastrophic failure of their operational planning. More concerning was his growing awareness that her calm demeanor suggested capabilities they had dramatically underestimated. His mind began racing through technical possibilities that could explain her survival: enhanced communication equipment, backup extraction protocols, medical modifications that exceeded standard Military capabilities. Graves demonstrated the most obvious psychological deterioration. His youth and relative inexperience left him unprepared for the emotional complexity of discovering that someone he'd helped attempt to murder was not only alive but apparently unaffected by the experience. His attempts to maintain normal behavior became increasingly mechanical and forced, drawing attention from other personnel who began to notice his unusual stress responses without understanding their source. Chun's strategy during this phase was masterful in its restraint. She could have confronted them immediately, demanded explanations, or reported the incident to command personnel. Instead, she chose to let their guilt and paranoia do the work of psychological destruction while she gathered comprehensive intelligence about their motivations, coordination methods, and potential connections to other personnel or external organizations. Her experimental conditioning had included extensive training in interrogation techniques that didn't require direct questioning, methods of extracting information through behavioral analysis and psychological pressure rather than confrontation. Her interactions with other base personnel were carefully calculated to seem routine while establishing her presence as undeniable fact that couldn't be dismissed or rationalized away. Brief conversations with logistics personnel confirmed her access to resources during her absence. Technical discussions with communications operators demonstrated continued familiarity with current operational procedures. Casual exchanges with medical staff allowed her to subtly gather intelligence about any inquiries regarding her whereabouts or condition, the most sophisticated aspect of Chun's psychological campaign was her apparent lack of awareness regarding her attackers' emotional states. She interacted with Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone else, creating the impression that she either hadn't identified them as threats or had chosen to ignore their hostility for reasons they couldn't predict. This uncertainty about her knowledge and intentions magnified their psychological stress while preventing them from taking defensive actions that might alert command personnel to underlying problems. Chun's enhanced conditioning allowed her to maintain this psychological pressure indefinitely, while monitoring its effects through observation techniques that exceeded normal human capabilities. Her modified sensory systems could detect stress pheromones, identify micro-expressions that revealed emotional states, and analyze vocal patterns that indicated deception or anxiety. She was conducting real-time psychological assessment of her targets while appearing to engage in routine professional activities. The base personnel began responding to subtle environmental changes that they couldn't consciously identify but instinctively recognized as significant. Conversations became more guarded. Routine activities were performed with increased attention to detail, and social interactions carried undercurrents of tension that no one could explain rationally. Chun's presence was affecting the entire base psychology in ways that suggested her experimental conditioning had included training in mass psychological manipulation techniques. By the end of the first day following her return, Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves were displaying stress symptoms severe enough to attract attention from senior personnel without revealing the specific source of their anxiety. Their sleep patterns were disrupted, their professional performance was declining, and their interpersonal relationships were becoming strained by behaviors they couldn't control or adequately explain. Chun's patient approach was transforming 3 confident military professionals into psychological casualties while simultaneously gathering comprehensive intelligence that would support whatever action she ultimately chose to take. Her experimental conditioning had taught her that the most effective revenge was often indistinguishable from justice, and justice required perfect information presented at optimal timing. The training exercise that would become legendary throughout The Special Operations community was scheduled for 1,400 hours on a Thursday afternoon when the jungle heat had reached its suffocating peak. Chen had requisitioned a close-quarters combat facility through proper channels, submitting paperwork that was routine in every respect except for one detail. She had specifically requested Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves as her training partners for what she termed advanced counter-betrayal scenarios. The official justification was continuing education and tactics, designed to address emerging threats in complex operational environments. Command approved the exercise without question, partly because Chen's experimental background gave her authority to design specialized training programs, but primarily because her recent survival ordeal had generated institutional interest in understanding how enhanced conditioning performed under real-world stress conditions. What Command didn't understand was that Chen's training request represented the culmination of a psychological campaign that had been systematically destroying her target's mental stability for 6 days. The combat facility had been configured according to Chen's precise specifications. Multiple observation platforms allowed comprehensive documentation from various angles, ensuring that whatever occurred during the exercise would be recorded in sufficient detail to support any subsequent investigations or training analysis. Professional lighting eliminated shadows that could obscure critical details, while audio equipment was calibrated to capture even whispered communications between participants. More importantly, Chen had arranged for an audience that included senior personnel, whose presence would prevent any attempts to suppress or mischaracterize the results of her demonstration. Major General Harrison attended as the facility's commanding officer. Colonel Martinez represented Special Operations oversight. Captain Thompson supervised medical personnel who would be available if the exercise produced injuries requiring immediate attention. The observation gallery included junior officers whose witness testimony would ensure that accurate accounts of the exercise reached appropriate levels of command authority. Rodriguez entered the facility with the confidence of someone who had dominated similar training scenarios throughout his 20-year career. But his psychological condition had deteriorated significantly during the previous week. His sleep deprivation was evident in his reaction times and decision-making processes. His paranoia had reached levels that interfered with his ability to distinguish between legitimate tactical concerns and imaginary threats. Most critically, his understanding of Chen's capabilities remained based on conventional assumptions that had been systematically invalidated by her survival and subsequent behavior. Williams accompanied him with technical equipment that he believed would provide advantages during the exercise, but his preparations revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what they would be confronting. His communication gear was configured for standard training protocols rather than the enhanced systems that Chen's experimental background allowed her to access. His analysis of her physical condition was based on conventional recovery timelines that didn't account for her modified healing processes. His tactical planning assumed limitations that her conditioning had specifically eliminated. Graves completed their triangle with equipment loads that suggested preparation for serious conflict rather than routine training exercises. His psychological state had become the most fragile of the three, marked by hypervigilance, emotional instability, and decision-making patterns that reflected deteriorating judgment under sustained stress. His attempts to maintain professional behavior were increasingly forced and artificial, drawing concerned attention from medical personnel who recognized symptoms of psychological breakdown. Chen's appearance was unremarkable except to observers with sufficient experience to recognize subtle indicators of enhanced capabilities. Her movement patterns showed no trace of the leg wound that should have required weeks of recovery and rehabilitation. Her equipment was arranged with precision that suggested preparation for scenarios significantly more complex than standard training exercises. Her demeanor carried the calm confidence of someone who possessed comprehensive understanding of variables that remained hidden from other participants. Exercise began with conventional protocols, warm-up procedures, safety briefings, and tactical scenario descriptions that sounded routine to casual observation. But Chen's implementation included modifications that would gradually reveal the true nature of what was about to unfold. Her scenario parameters were designed to replicate the conditions of their original betrayal while providing legal framework for demonstrating enhanced combat capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. The most sophisticated aspect of Chen's preparation was her psychological conditioning of the audience. Her briefing materials included references to experimental training programs that prepared observers for witnessing capabilities that might challenge conventional understanding of human limitations. Her safety protocols were more comprehensive than standard requirements, suggesting that the exercise might produce results requiring specialized medical intervention. Her legal documentation was more thorough than routine training demanded, indicating preparation for scenarios where official investigation might become necessary. Rodriguez's confidence began eroding immediately when Chen's opening movements demonstrated mobility that contradicted everything he believed about her current physical condition. Her injured leg showed no signs of weakness, limitation, or compensatory behavior that should have resulted from significant trauma followed by field treatment under primitive conditions. More unsettling was her tactical positioning, which suggested awareness of threats that hadn't been officially presented as part of the exercise scenario. Williams' technical advantages proved inadequate when Chen's communication capabilities exceeded the parameters of his equipment configuration. Her systems operated on frequencies that his gear couldn't access, with encryption protocols that his standard military training hadn't prepared him to recognize or counter. His attempts to establish technological dominance were systematically neutralized by capabilities that appeared to violate conventional limitations of military communication equipment. The observation gallery began responding to subtle indicators that the exercise was deviating from routine training parameters. Chen's movements were too fluid, too precise, too efficient for someone recently recovered from serious trauma. Her tactical decisions were too sophisticated, too comprehensive, too effective for scenarios that were supposed to test basic combat skills rather than advanced operational capabilities. What the audience was witnessing was the activation of experimental conditioning that transformed routine training into demonstration of capabilities that most military personnel would never encounter during conventional careers. Confrontation reached its crescendo in a sequence of movements so fluid and devastating that the observation gallery fell into stunned silence. Chen's demonstration wasn't merely about physical dominance. It was a comprehensive dismantling of her betrayer's capabilities, psychology, and future prospects within the military hierarchy. What unfolded over the next 17 minutes would be studied, analyzed, and referenced in classified training materials for years to come. Rodriguez made the first aggressive move, attempting to use his size and experience advantages to overwhelm Chen through conventional grappling techniques. His approach was textbook correct for standard combat scenarios, but Chen's experimental conditioning had prepared her for opponents who relied on predictable methodologies. Her response was immediate and surgical. She redirected his momentum while simultaneously applying pressure points that her enhanced anatomical knowledge allowed her to locate with supernatural precision. Rodriguez found himself on the ground before his nervous system could process what had occurred. The most unsettling aspect of Chen's technique was her apparent lack of effort. She moved with the economical grace of someone performing familiar routines rather than engaging in serious combat. Her breathing remained steady, her expression calm, her movements precise, but never rushed. What should have been desperate struggle was transformed into clinical demonstration, as if she was teaching a class, rather than defending her life against multiple attackers. Williams attempted to coordinate with Rodriguez through communication signals that Chen intercepted and neutralized before they could be implemented. Her enhanced sensory capabilities allowed her to detect their tactical coordination while simultaneously developing countermeasures that turned their collaboration into vulnerability. When Williams moved to flank her position, Chen's positioning and timing were so precise that his attack vector became an opportunity for her to demonstrate joint manipulation techniques that left him immobilized without permanent injury. Graves's participation became increasingly frantic as he witnessed his teammates' systematic defeat by someone they had attempted to murder just days earlier. His attacks lacked the controlled precision of professional combat training, degenerating into desperate attempts to inflict damage through superior aggression rather than superior skill. Chen's response was to allow his aggression to exhaust itself while demonstrating defensive techniques that made his efforts appear clumsy and ineffective. Observation Gallery was witnessing something unprecedented in military training. A single operator systematically defeating multiple opponents while apparently enjoying the experience. Chen's enhanced conditioning wasn't just allowing her to fight effectively despite her recent trauma. It was enabling her to fight better because of it. Her wound had activated capabilities that remained dormant during normal circumstances, transforming potential weakness into devastating advantage. Major General Harrison leaned forward in his observation chair, his experience allowing him to recognize that Chen's performance exceeded normal human capabilities by margins that suggested experimental enhancement rather than exceptional training. His understanding of classified programs was sufficient to realize that he was witnessing the practical application of conditioning that most military personnel would never encounter. More importantly, he was observing evidence that suggested Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves had made a catastrophic miscalculation about their target's true capabilities. The psychological impact on Chen's opponents was as devastating as her physical dominance. Rodriguez's confidence collapsed completely as he realized that everything he had believed about military hierarchy, tactical superiority, and personal competence was being systematically disproven by someone half his size who was apparently enjoying the process. Williams's technical expertise proved irrelevant against capabilities that operated beyond conventional parameters. Graves's youth and aggression were transformed into liability rather than advantage by someone whose conditioning had prepared her for exactly these scenarios. Chen's final demonstration was the most comprehensive. She simultaneously engaged all three opponents while providing clinical commentary on their tactical errors, psychological weaknesses, and professional inadequacies. Her voice remained calm and instructional throughout the encounter, as if she was conducting advanced training rather than exacting revenge for attempted murder. The effect on the observation gallery was profound. They were witnessing not just superior combat performance, but superior human performance that redefined their understanding of possible achievements. The exercise concluded when Chen had positioned Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves in submission holds that demonstrated complete control without inflicting permanent damage. Their defeat was total, undeniable, and professionally documented from multiple angles by equipment that would ensure accurate reporting to command authority. More importantly, their psychological destruction was complete. They would never recover the confidence, competence, or credibility that had characterized their previous military careers. Chen's statement to the observation gallery was delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire performance. Experimental conditioning protocols, demonstrate enhanced effectiveness when operators are required to perform under trauma conditions. This exercise confirms that enhanced personnel can maintain superior tactical capabilities when conventional advantages have been compromised through hostile action or environmental factors. Recommend expansion of conditioning programs for personnel designated for high-risk operational environments. Major General Harrison's post-exercise report would trigger investigations that exposed the conspiracy behind the original attack while simultaneously establishing Chen as the primary authority on enhanced combat conditioning within the special operations community. Rodriguez, Williams, and Graves would face court-martial proceedings that would end their military careers and result in prison sentences that reflected the severity of attempting to murder a fellow service member. The final question posed to viewers around the world was delivered through digital platforms that reached millions of people. When someone stabs you in the leg thinking they're ending your career, but instead they activate capabilities they never knew existed, what does that teach us about the hidden potential that emerges when we're pushed beyond every limit we thought we had? And if betrayal can become the key that unlocks extraordinary abilities, what other challenges in your life might actually be opportunities for transformation that you haven't recognized yet? The story concluded with an invitation to share experiences of finding strength through adversity. Subscribe for more accounts of human potential under extreme conditions, and consider whether the greatest victories sometimes come disguised as the worst defeats. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.